to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Rosa Luxemburg, one of the greatest revolutionary figures in history. Rosa Luxemburg was born on March 5th, 1871, in the city of Zamość in southeastern Poland. Despite her premature and violent death at the age of 47, she ranks with Lenin and Trotsky among the most important Marxist leaders and theoreticians of the 20th century. Luxemburg played a leading role in the Second International and was a founder and leader of the Marxist movement in Poland. In the German social democracy, the SPD, Luxemburg was the most important figure in the struggle against Bernstein, the revisionist wing of the party, the conservatism and reactionary role of the trade unions, and also the centrism of Karl Kautsky. During World War I, Luxemburg, together with Karl Liebknecht, led the fight against the betrayal of the SPD and its support for German imperialism in the war. She played a critical role in the founding of the Spartacus League and later on the Communist Party of Germany. On January 15, in 1919, she and Liebknecht were murdered by right-wing Freikorps soldiers at the behest of the SPD after the crushing of the Spartacist uprising in Berlin. This meeting will examine Luxemburg's role as a Marxist theoretician and political leader and discuss the contemporary significance of her legacy for the fight against capitalism, dictatorship and war, and the building of a Marxist leadership of the working class internationally. I'm Johannes Stern, and I will be co-moderating today's discussion. I would like to, and I'm very glad to, introduce our panelists today. That is Ulrich Rippert, the National Secretary of the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei, the German section of the ICFI. Comrade Peter Schwarz, he is the Secretary of the International Committee of the Fourth International and the editor of the German language edition of the World Socialist website. Both comrades have been active in the Trotskyist movement for decades and have written extensively on the history of the early SPD and the Marxist movement in Germany. Comrade Peter has just published an important essay on Rosa Luxemburg, which will be very much the basis for this discussion. I also want to introduce and welcome my co-moderator, David North. David is the chairperson of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website and the national chairperson of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. David has played a leading role in the international socialist movement for now over 45 years, and he has published many books, lectures, essays on the questions we will discuss tonight. Before we begin with the discussion, and I already want to stress that we also welcome questions from the audience, David will make some further introductory remarks on the character and the significance of this meeting. David?
Dave, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Comrade Johannes. The International Committee, as comrades who follow our work all over the world and readers of the World Socialist website certainly know, honors and its history. We look upon critical anniversaries as dates which we recall in order to reaffirm the continuity of the revolutionary Marxist movement. Figures such as Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, and their great forebears, Marx and Engels, are recognized as by our movement as the theoretical titans of modern socialism. And we draw upon their work and the great revolutionary experiences which they analyzed and theoretically examined, and of course their achievements as revolutionaries, in order to understand more clearly and more precisely the tasks of our own time. Now, today we're honoring the 150th anniversary of the birth of Rosa Luxemburg. She is, of course, a monumental figure in the history of international socialism. And like so many, as is so often the case in the history of the revolutionary movement, in the aftermath of their death, as decades passed, efforts are made to change their political personalities, to somehow accommodate the lives of such revolutionaries to the needs of bourgeois society. That is particularly the case with Rosa Luxemburg. Lenin wrote in the beginning of State and Revolution words which are very appropriate as we begin this meeting. At the time, he wrote these as he set out to explain the teachings of Marx and Engels on the question of the state. He wrote these words in this book as he was preparing the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. And he wrote the following. What is now happening to Marx's doctrine has, in the course of history, often happened to the doctrines of other revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes struggling for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes have visited relentless persecution on them and received their teaching with the most savage hostility, the most furious hatred, the most ruthless campaign of lies and slanders. After their death, attempts are made to turn them into harmless icons, canonize them, and surround their names with a certain halo for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping them, while at the same time emasculating and vulgarizing the real essence of their revolutionary theories and blunting their revolutionary edge. At the present time, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement are co-opting in this work of adulterating Marxism. They omit, obliterate, and distort the revolutionary side of its teaching, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. That, of course, has been the fate of Rosa Luxemburg. Murdered in 1919, is decades past, and particularly during the last half-century, as we have seen the emergence of the influence of the Frankfurt School and various forms of petty bourgeois anti-Marxist politics, efforts are made to portray Rosa Luxemburg as something of a kindly lady, a feminist, a sort of early Hannah Arendt, who would have felt most comfortable teaching at the New School in New York City. She was nothing of the sort. She was a revolutionist. She was dedicated to the overthrow, through revolutionary means, of capitalist society. She harbored no illusions about the nature of the struggle, about its intensity, and its world historical significance. Now, one of the aims of the 2 hours we have this afternoon is to review very critical aspects of her life, her theoretical and practical work, to clarify as best we can certain key episodes in her extraordinarily active and heroic life, and in particular, her attitude both to issues such as spontaneism, the trade unions, the struggle against reformism in all its different forms, militarism, and of course her attitude to the Russian Revolution. So if we can clarify some of these issues, and also examine critically controversial issues and even differences that existed between herself and Lenin in various issues, I think this will be a very, very profitable and valuable 2 hours. Now, I'd like to begin by posing a question to Comrade Peter, who has written a really excellent essay on the life of Luxemburg entitled 150 Years Since the Birth of Rosa Luxemburg. I'd like to ask Peter if he can very concisely to give us a picture of Rosa Luxemburg, the person. How did she come at so early an age to the attention of the international socialist movement? What was her background, her personality, the character of her early interventions in German and Polish and Russian social democracy? Comrade Peter.
Yes, thank you, Dave. Well, Luxemburg was 2.5 years old when her family moved to Warsaw. Both Zamość, where she was born, and Warsaw at the time were part of the Russian Empire. And since a national uprising in 1863, in which her father actually participated, there has been enormous repression and Russification in Poland. At a very young age, she participated in socialist movements. And these were movements which were continuously persecuted and disbanded by the police. In addition to that, of course, there was tremendous anti-Semitism. There was a pogrom in Warsaw when she was 10 years old, where many houses in her surrounding were ransacked. She went to gymnasium, to high school in Warsaw, and finished it at the age of 17 as the best of her class. She was obviously an extremely talented girl. Also at the time, she was already quite well versed in Marxism. She then had to avoid arrest and to actually study, leave the country secretly when she was 17 years old, and she moved to Zurich. Zurich University at the time was the only German language university in Europe where women were fully accepted. Zurich also was the center of emigration, particularly from the Tsarist Empire. Between 1888 and 1892, out of 1,700 students which were accepted at the university, 126 were emigres from the Tsarist Empire. Many or most of them were politically active, not all of them in the socialist movement, but many of the longtime comrades who worked with Luxemburg to his death, like Leo Jokiches, Varsky, Dzerzhinsky, and others, she met there, or she met when she went several times to see other groups in France. She was an extremely far-sighted and courageous woman. One has to say that at a very early age, she had a foresight and clarity on issues which only became clarified in coming events. When she was 22, she applied to participate in the Third Congress of the Second International, which took place in Zurich. She and her friends had founded a newspaper which opposed the Polish Socialist Party, which was led by Pilsudski, the later general and then dictator of Poland. At the time, Pilsudski, who had actually started his career with Lenin Brothers amongst the Nabotnikis, the Russian terrorists, called himself a socialist, but in fact his socialism was just sought the means to achieve Polish independence. Luxemburg opposed the reconstitution of a Polish state, a position which had been the standard position of the Marxist movement up to that time, promoted both by Marx and Engels. Her argument was that conditions had fundamentally changed, that both Poland and Russia had started to develop economically, that the working class had emerged, and that this working class could not be subordinated to a nationalist perspective, but rather the Polish and the Russian working class had to unite to overthrow Tsarism. This doesn't mean that Luxembourg is indifferent to cultural issues. In fact, at a later time, when the Prussian government imposed a ferocious policy of Germanization on the Polish part of Germany, it was her who moved resolutions in the International, in the Social Democracy, and wrote very powerful pamphlets opposing that and defending the right of the Polish workers to speak their language. But she did that not from the standpoint of producing or calling a Polish state, but rather from the standpoint of proving to the Polish workers that their real allies and supporters were the German workers and German democracy and the international democracy, and not the Polish bourgeoisie. When she was 26, she passed her doctoral work with the highest degree. It was a Marxist work, which is actually republished in the collected works, because it was devoted to her major political theme, the development of capitalism in Poland. In the same year, she started to publish, actually she had become Kautsky and many other leaders of the Second International had noted her when she spoke at 22 at the Congress. And in the same year that she wrote her doctoral thesis, Bernstein published a series of articles which founded or became the basis of his revisionism. After having done her doctoral thesis, Luxemburg decided to go to Berlin. This was in 1898 at the age of 27. And when she arrived there, she started immediately to write an answer to Bernstein, which was then published in Die Neue Zeit. That became part later of the book, which was published under the title Social Reform or Revolution. That book made her one of the leading voices of the left wing, not only in German social democracy, but in the international. She started to write regularly for Die Neue Zeit. She published literally hundreds of articles in different newspapers of the Social Democrats. Due to the fact that she spoke many languages, 4 of them fluently, she followed the Dreyfus case in France. She followed the Russian Revolution. In 1905, before she moved to Russia, she published 80 articles on the Russian Revolution in Vorwärts, the central organ of the SPD. And in the following years, she became a leader of the Second International, participating both in all the congresses as well as in the International Socialist Bureau, which was a sort of an executive of the International. But she was not only a fabulous writer, she was also a fabulous agitator. When she spoke on election meetings, the room was full. Immediately when she came to Berlin, she was sent to Silesia, the Polish area, which belonged to Germany at the time, and to conduct the election campaign, and the number of votes increased 5 times by the SPD. In 1903, when she did another campaign, at one meeting 2,000 people came. When the secretary of the SPD spoke, Ignaz Auer, only 45 turned up. So she was an extremely popular figure amongst workers exactly because she had a revolutionary attitude. She was not only a leader of the SPD and the International, she was also the actual leader of the Polish party, the Social Democratic Party of the Congress Poland and later also Lithuania, which after the 1905 revolution in 1907 had 40,000 members. She generally did this under a pseudonym in order not to have a conflict with her work, but many of her Polish articles, which she wrote at the time, have only been published in German over the last 10 years. And among them are excellent articles. There's a whole book on anti-Semitism, on other issues, which I think are hardly known up to now to a broader audience, of the many Marxist works she wrote. In addition to that, of course, she was someone who was very interested and knew about literature, music. Just to give you one example, in one letter she described in 1902 how she went to a concert of Bronislaw Huberman, who was a friend of her brother and became one of the most world-famous violinists in the first half of the 20th century. At the time he was 19, and she writes, "I will go to every concert he will have in Berlin." But she was, I think, even if you look at her age, I mean, she was 22 when she spoke on the Congress. She was 27 and 28 when she took up the conflict with Bernstein. I think shows what the extraordinary personality she was. She had also great interest for nature. She was a very passionate woman. A lot of her letters have been maintained, or part of her correspondence have been maintained and published. And she never wavered in her revolutionary convictions.
Peter, you already covered a lot of ground, and you mentioned the fact that when she came to Berlin in 1998, she was immediately drawn into the struggle against Bernstein and the question of defending Marxism, the Marxist revolutionary conception against the revisionism of Bernstein. I think it would be good if you could you elaborate a bit? What was this conflict about? What were the different arguments? What was, I mean, social reform and revolution was, of course, Luxemburg's main and maybe most famous book she wrote on these issues. And immediately she confronted, of course, a lot of support among workers in the SPD, but also a lot of opposition for her intervention. I think even at the beginning, Kautsky was somewhat reluctant to take these issues up. She pushed him to intervene. But could you give a certain overview of this enormous historical struggle and what was involved and what were the different arguments?
Well, Bernstein was a very well-known figure within the SPD. He was one of its founders. He had spent a long time in exile in London. Actually, he only came back in 1903 because there was a sentence against him, which wasn't lifted before that. And he had for quite some time worked with Engels. He was also a friend of Kautsky, had worked with him, wrote regularly for Die Neue Zeit, theoretical organs and other newspapers. And he started to write a series of articles which were published by Die Neue Zeit between 1896 and 1898 under the title Problems of Socialism. Now, even before Bernstein, there had been very right-wing tendencies within the SPD. There was this famous El Dorado speech given by Vollmar at the beginning of the 1890s, which was attacked many fundamental principles of the SPD. But what Bernstein did, he didn't limit himself to criticize or reject certain policies. He wrote a series which was an attack really on the fundamentals of Marxism. Politically, he proposed that the Social Democrats should abandon revolution and openly declared them to be a reformist party. He explained that the trade unions would be the main means to achieve socialism through gradual reforms within the framework of capitalism. He attacked capital, the theory of crisis. He said that one should reject the idea that capitalism, through its own inner contradiction, is prone to crisis. This was, of course, an adaptation to the enormous economic boom and expansion which took place between 1890 and 1910, when German capitalism became, both economically and politically a world power. And he also attacked dialectical and historical materialism. He openly promoted Kant. He said that socialism should be an ethical postulate, this kind of ethical liberalism, and that all these ideas that you can have a scientific socialism, that you can base socialism on an actual analysis of capitalist society and its inner laws, is impossible. He openly said that socialism cannot be a science. So this was a very, very fundamental challenge to the entire theoretical and political basis of social democracy. Now, the astonishing thing was that Kautsky, who published this in die Neue Zeit, didn't answer it for 2 years. He didn't want to get into conflict with his friend Hede. The first ones who answered, one of the first ones was actually Pavos, Alexander Pavos. His real name was Israel Helpand, also a Russian emigre who was very active in German social democracy at the time. He later degenerated, but that's another chapter. And of course, Plekhanov wrote on it, and Luxemburg was the first one to give a very, very sharp answer to him. I think it's hard also to summarize her book in a few words, but she basically defended the philosophical, economic theories of Marxism against Bernstein very strongly. And she also made the point, which I quoted in my article, that if you take away the final aim, as Bernstein called it, from the SPD, socialism, you're liquidating the socialist movement. She also had a very, I think, sharp chapter, we maybe come back to that, on the role of the trade unions and the idea that socialism achieved by the trade union struggle. Now, Kautsky published his articles, and in the same year she spoke on the Social Democratic Congress against Bernstein. This became a very, very long and ferocious debate, which lasted for several years. It was only in 1903 at the Dresden conference that the resolution was passed, definitely rejecting Bernstein. In 1904, the 6th Congress of the Second International in Amsterdam did the same. There, the two main speakers were Bebel, who defended Marxism, and Jean Jaurès, the leader of the French, or one leader of the French Socialist Party, who defended revisionism, but also the International at the time passed a resolution denouncing and rejecting revisionism, at least in theory.
If I could ask Comrade Olli a question on this. First of all, it would be helpful to give some sense of what the social democracy in Germany was, what it represented, and what were the changes taking place inside the social democracy, inside the workers' movement in general, that found expression in the great debate over opportunism. Olli?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I first of all have to apologize for my very limited English language. And if I stuck, I have to switch into German. And Dave, who speaks much better German than I speak English, then can help me out. Well, when Rosa Luxemburg came to Berlin in 1898, the Social Democratic Party was already a mass party. And I think it is quite important to understand what that means. It was not a party like other parties. It was a socialist culture movement which intervened or organized the life of the working class in all aspects. It was built by workers. August Bebel, who was the principal leader and founder of the early social democracy, was a worker and self-educated. He studied the books by Marx and Engels. He became very close collaborator of Engels. And he then in 1869 founded the Workers' Social Democratic Party, which later became the SPD. This was 2 years before the German war against France. And based on the victory against France, there was an enormous industrial development in Germany. The German Reich was declared in Versailles, and based on the German unification, an enormous industrial development took place, and with it, a development of the working class. And so the early development of the SPD was extremely stürmisch, stormy. You had the parliament faction was growing. The SPD did win more influence. The government of Bismarck responded by to ban the party socialist law, which was from 1878 to 1890. But the parliament faction continued during this time, and during this period of suppression and illegality, the mobilization of the working class got even stronger. There were all kinds of social democratic workers' initiatives, culture initiatives. I think the SPD at that time had 75 papers, nearly 50 of them daily papers, million workers who read the social democratic coverage and papers. So the influence of the SPD was enormous. It grew to the biggest party in Germany. And it was politically based on Marxism and a socialist internationalist perspective. But at the same time, the political activity of the party was limited to reforms, to create conditions or achieve conditions of better labor conditions, better wages. And the party had founded the trade unions. And what then developed was that there was a very objective conflict between the programmatic foundation of the party, the Revolutionary Internationalist Program, and its daily work, its daily practice. And the practice of the union, which grew under the development of the working class quite rapidly, was bound. There was a growing conflict developing, as Peter already spoke about, between the trade unions and the SPD. As more the trade unions grew and got stronger and got wealthy and got more money, they came in sharper conflict with the party. The reason for that is
an important point, Oli. In the early stages, it was the social democracy which both founded and actually financed the early growth of the trade unions.
That's true. That's exactly true. And the interesting thing is that that's a very important aspect, a very important historical fact. In Germany, the development of the labor movement started with a political party. And this party founded the unions. But even under these conditions, the unions developed very sharply to the right and against a socialist perspective and against the party. And the reason for that is that the unions and the whole concept of the unions is strongly connected with capitalism itself. The unions are concentrated on a very specific task to negotiate conditions and wages, and therefore they accept the framework of capitalist exploitation. They try to mobilize the working class, at least at that time, to put pressure against the bourgeoisie in order to get concessions and to increase wages. Today, that has already totally transformed. But at that time, they were able to achieve certain conditions, but they defended the capitalist property relations. And that was the basic conflict, as Peter already referred.
I think our listeners should know, when Comrade Oli speaks about these questions, he himself, particularly in the late 70s, early 80s, led very serious struggles of workers, actually one of the most important occupations. What was that time, West Germany was led by Oli, so I think he knows of what he speaks. It is the nature of the IG Metall. But coming back to the conflicts within the social democracy, Peter already mentioned that at a number of party congresses, the revolutionary line was actually officially upheld. How is this organized? How can one explain this? That even the delegates from the trade unions, in many cases, would accept, in principle, a revolutionary line while pursuing in practice what was essentially a reformist practice. Either Peter or Oli, do you want to?
No, I mean, that is not so difficult to understand. That was the practical expression of the objective conflict which existed. Later, in the analysis of the breakdown of the Second International, Lenin and Trotsky especially have analyzed this quite sharply and profound. This conflict between the programmatic orientation, the revolutionary program, and the day-to-day praxis created this conflict. And on the congresses, you always had tensions, but as long for a whole part of the development of the early SPD, the Bebel and the revolutionary perspective was able to lead and to give the orientation, and the trade unions accepted that. There was a profound change, 1905. But before I go into that, I would say one point. I would like to refer to one point, because Dave has already said that my early stage of political work started with the unions. This what Peter referred to the book by Rosa Luxemburg, Sozialreform oder Revolution, Social Reform or Revolution. This was one of these books which had huge impact on workers. And it was basically the first, or let's say the second book, a Marxist book I read in the late 60s, after the Communist Manifesto. I got it at a trade union school. At that time, the schools at the union were organized by the SDS, the radical student movement. And for me, that was extremely important to understand the conflict between a socialist perspective, the struggle to mobilize the working class internationally to overcome capitalism and establish a higher, a new society based on equality, or trade unionism. And I then I started apprenticeship 67, and 2 years later I was delegated a national convention of the IG Metall, and I had the book with me. Yeah, and I mean, it was not possible. I mean, even at that time, the trade union was already extremely to the right, and the whole SPD, of course, was a total different party.
Just on this question, in the developing conflict, would it be true to say that notwithstanding the increasingly heavy presence of the trade union bureaucracy, the adaptation which they still felt compelled to make reflected the very strong revolutionary orientation of broad sections of the German working class? I think that Luxemburg wrote, particularly for the Leipziger Social Democratic newspaper, it should be pointed out that the German Social Democracy had scores of papers throughout the country, but there was a substantial and very powerful constituency for revolutionary politics within the German working class.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, and there was very, very strong opposition against the trade union bureaucracy. Especially when the confrontation between the union leadership and the SPD intensified after the First Russian Revolution, 1905. That was a real important turning point, because to a certain extent you can say that the question, which was a theoretical struggle before, turned into a vicious political confrontation, and you could see that it was a struggle of different social forces. The trade union leadership, the trade union bureaucracy had represented or was part of a opportunist tendency, petty bourgeois tendency, which more and more explicitly and even aggressively moved against revolutionary conception. And that was directed against Rosa Luxemburg.
Can we discuss this question? Because again, there are many comrades and listeners all over the world who are following this discussion and may not be necessarily familiar with 1905. What was, broadly speaking, first of all, what was it? And what was its significance? How was it assessed within the social democratic movement? Why this event? Why was this so critical in changing the political atmosphere within Germany itself?
I mean, first of all, the 1905 revolution, I mean, what happened, I mean, most listeners will know that in January 1905, a mass demonstration of several thousand workers and peasants demonstrated in Petrograd, and the Tsar army shot them brutally. There were thousands dead and many thousand wounded, and that unleashed a massive revolutionary development and uprising in the working class. At that time, you had in Russia already a working class. In many factories were not Russian factories, but it were European and international capitalists who invested there and used the exploitation which was guaranteed by the Tsarist regime. But you already in Russia at that time had quite big factories and a very revolutionary development in the working class. That had enormous impact on the working class in Germany and all over Europe. And it was combined with a revolutionary radicalization in Europe itself. It is very interesting when you read the first article which Rosa Luxemburg wrote on the situation in Russia in January 1905. It is 3 days after the Bloody Sunday. She, at that first article, she already makes two absolutely decisive remarks and point of analysis. First, she says, it is not possible to look at this event as a Russian event, as a national event. It has to be historically seen as the outcome, or let's say the in the historic frame, the French Revolution then of 1789, then the European Revolution of 1848, and the Russian Revolution is a continuation of that revolutionary uprising in Europe. And she says, it still is, the task is a bourgeois revolution, to bring down the Tsarist, the feudal regime, and to establish democratic forms of rule. And she says, and that is the second important analysis, she says, the new in this development is the leading force is not the bourgeoisie, it's the working class. And therefore, it has to be seen as an international event. And when I think this first article makes clear how close Luxemburg analysis was with Trotsky, who himself was a leading figure in this revolutionary uprising in Petrograd. He was still very young, but he became the head and leader of the workers' councils, the Soviets, and he later developed, based on that experience or on that historical development, his perspective of permanent revolution. But Luxemburg was very close to that analysis from the very beginning.
If I could step in here, Uli, I think it would be good to develop this point of 1905 a bit further. There are already a number of questions coming in. There's one listener, she's asking on the question of also Rosa Luxemburg's conception of the 1905 revolution and her perspective of a political mass strike. What were the differences of this conception to an anarchist mass strike? Also her being a participant, an active participant of the 1905 revolution. And then Comrade Uri already mentioned Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. So I think it would be good if we could talk a bit more concretely about what was really Rosa Luxemburg's conception and analysis of the 1905 revolution. What lessons did she draw? What was her political perspective she developed out of it? And what was maybe the difference to an anarchist conception if we talk about a mass strike? And what was also the differences, even if these conceptions were close, Luxemburg and Trotsky, the differences between Luxemburg's analysis of 1905 and Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Maybe, Comrade Peter, you could make some points on this?
Yeah, well, just to go back to the last point, I think, why was 1905 such an important turning point? I think there were several aspects. One, of course, it goes back to the very point Luxemburg made when she spoke for the first time to the Second International. She said the fundamental issue since Marx and Engels, which has changed, is the emergence of the Polish and the Russian working class as an active factor. That's why she rejected the old slogan of Polish independence. One of the main arguments of Marx and Engels had been that this would be some kind of democratic Poland, would be sort of cordon sanitaire against the center of European reaction, that is Tsarist Russia. Now, you had in the most backward and reactionary country of Europe, you had a massive uprising of the working class, which developed two new forms of struggle, the political mass strike and the Soviet. That's what Luxemburg had been orientated to from the beginnings. He saw that coming. And her approach, and Uli already said that, but you can find that in all her articles on the Russian Revolution. She always insisted this has to be seen as an international event. This is not just a Russian event. And things, of course, had changed. The 1890s were characterized by an enormous expansion of capitalism in Germany, in the United States, in many other areas, a growth of the working class. But that had also developed imperialism, militarism was on the growth, class tensions became very acute. And actually at the beginning of 1905, before the Russian events happened, the biggest strike in the German mines took place with 200,000 miners striking for several weeks. They were finally defeated, but that was certainly a sign of coming events. And while the trade union bureaucracy was moving to the right, and because they feared, these revolutionary developments, of course, Luxemburg fully welcomed them. She was writing, as I said before, every day in the Vorwärts on the Russian events, and finally she decided to go very much against the resistance of the SPD leadership to Warsaw herself. Actually, Kautsky and his wife personally brought her to the Berlin railway station to say goodbye to her. And she worked in Warsaw, was then arrested, and, thanks to the German Social Democrats, she came out and then went straight to St. Petersburg and to Finland, where she had a lot of discussions with Lenin. Now, if you read her line on the Russian Revolution, I think she was very close to Trotsky. I mean, she was, there are many articles. There's one, first of all, she, of course, was close to Pawus, who was a member both of the German party and the Polish party. And he elaborated the theory of permanent revolution together with Trotsky. Luxemburg always stressed, as Trotsky did, the international character of the revolution. She didn't support Lenin's perspective of a democratic dictatorship of the peasantry and the working class. She thought that was not viable. And in one article, for instance, which he wrote in May 1905, in a revolutionary hour, what next? She said, I have to translate it from the German, if we say to the workers now, concentrate all your power on conquering political freedom and fight with the bourgeoisie, and the fight against the bourgeoisie delays is for tomorrow, this can only be said by the nationalists of the different colors, which try to use the workers to realize their own goals. For the Social Democrats, political freedoms for which we fight are only an instrument in the class struggle of the proletariat. And that's why the final goal of the social democracy, the socialist aims, are inseparably bound up with the daily aims, the political and economic struggle, the struggle against absolutism, and the struggle against the bourgeoisie. So she always insisted on the leading role of the working class in the revolution, and she also insisted that the working class cannot subordinate its own socialist aims to the aims of the bourgeoisie. Now, she never went as far and worked out the theory of permanent revolution as clearly as Trotsky then did after that, but I think, in many issues she was very close to him, and she saw the Russian Revolution, of which she was a part. In fact, later on, the Polish movement joined the Russian party again. They never joined the Bolsheviks, they were sort of in between. After 1905, Luxemburg was clearly closer to the Bolsheviks and to the Mensheviks, but she had, continuing differences with Lenin on the national question, on other issues. But I think her understanding of that revolution was very clear, and that brought her in then the conflict with the trade union bureaucracy, and to which later on, I'm not going into detail in this now, but later on, Kautsky and Bebel, adapted to this, became much sharper.
Initially, perhaps you might comment on this, actually Kautsky, in the period of 1905 and 1906, was very close to Luxemburg. And that may well be seen as the period of the high tide of his revolutionary orientation. But I would like, since it's certainly in the context of the discussion of 1905, and it often comes up in any discussion of Rosa Luxemburg, and I know we have questions which are coming in along these lines, since it relates to the issue of Luxemburg's attitude toward Bolshevism and differences she may or may not have had with Lenin. That's the question of the mass strike. It was certainly to become a focal point of her conflicts within social democracy. Peter, you raised this in your essay. Could you discuss this? And Comrade Olli, could you discuss this issue of the mass strike and its place in the theoretical and political conflicts and practical conflicts inside the social democracy?
Yeah, maybe I start on that. I mean, the trade union reacted to the Russian Revolution of 1905 with enormous, the trade union leadership reacted with hostility. They feared very much that it breaks over the border into Western Europe, and they attacked Luxemburg's campaign for the mass strikes ferociously. You can say there was something, how to say, krankhaft in the attacks which they led against.
Yeah, he was saying there's something sick about it. Almost had a sick character.
I mean, for instance, the union right away, the union organized right away a congress in Cologne, and there they pushed through a resolution where they attacked the general strike and mass strike and Luxembourg enormously. This is a congress where Karl Legien, who was the leader of the General Council of the trade union, made his famous speech under the headline Generalstreik is General Unsinn. General strike is general nonsense. And then I think it was Theodor Blomberg who led the commission to work out a resolution. And in that resolution, I read it in German, the first paragraph. It says, den Generalstreik, wie er von Anarchisten und Leuten ohne jegliche Erfahrung auf dem Gebiet des wirtschaftlichen Kampfs vertreten wird, hält der Kongress für indiskutabel. Er warnt die Arbeiter.
Let me just. He says that the general strike question, as it is being raised by anarchists, is absolutely, or he's attributing to Luxemburg an anarchistic position, which was untrue. But he says the question of the general strike is being raised at the Congress is completely unacceptable.
Ja, er warnt die Arbeiterschaft, sich durch die Aufnahme und Verbreitung solcher Ideen von der täglichen Kleinarbeit zur Stärkung der Arbeiterorganisationen abhalten zu lassen.
And he says that it's absolutely impermissible that the workers should in any way relate the issue of general strike to the daily tasks of the working class movement.
Bommelburg attacks Luxemburg as anarchist, putschist, and even anti-Semite attacks, which he uses against her.
Could I just ask, since we have a question which came up directly on this issue, what is the distinction between Luxemburg's conception of mass strike or general strike and that of the anarchists?
Well, I think Peter already referred to that. I mean, for Luxemburg, the mass strike was bound up with the building of a revolutionary movement in the working class to take power. And has nothing to do with a conception to reject organization, to reject state structure. For Luxemburg, it was the instrument to mobilize the working class, to smash the capitalist state and establish a workers' state and a workers' government. Luxemburg was based on Marx and the whole conception that it is necessary to build a worker state in order to establish a free society. It's not possible in any other form. The working class has to take power. And
maybe just to go at this also somewhat, historically. I mean, until that point, the political struggle of the Social Democrats was mainly limited to, propaganda and, of course, parliamentary means. Strike was an economic means to fight for improvements, higher wages. And what Luxemburg was speaking about, of course, was the political mass strike, to use the strike as a means to fight for political aims. There was a tradition in the revolutionary movement, particularly of the early middle 18th century, of barricade struggles. Like, in 1848 in the Paris Commune, but she said that's no longer really the case. But the workers should now use their economic power, their possibility to strike, their possibility to paralyze the economy, to fight for political means. So it became bound up, with the struggle for workers' power. Now the anarchists, of course, rejected this totally. They didn't fight for workers' power. For them, it was basically a means to achieve certain goals. But I think, and that's why the trade unions became so hostile, because that developed even before. But they definitely, even though they voted for the resolutions for some time, they had already made up their mind that fighting for workers' power is so disturbing their work, it's threatening their organizations, it's threatening their finance, their positions, and so on. That's why the struggle became so absolutely sharp. And of course, then in 1917 in Russia and in 1918 in Germany, where literally millions, hundreds of thousands of millions of workers, went on strike, went on mass demonstrations, and then, tried to conquer power. That perspective was entirely confirmed. And Luxemburg always insisted, that it's not the task of the Social Democrats to organize the mass strike. It has to prepare the working class for it. It has to propagate it. It has to make this idea, and this conception a widespread conception in order then to conduct this fight.
I just quote just on this section, because it's again one of the issues which is central to the misrepresentation of Luxemburg. In her very critical essay, The Mass Strike, Party and Trade Unions, she wrote the following: "The Russian Revolution, which is the first historical experience on the model of the mass strike, does not in the least imply a vindication of anarchism, but actually means the historical liquidation of anarchism. The sorry existence to which this intellectual tendency was condemned in recent decades by the powerful development of social democracy in Germany may, to a certain extent, be explained by the exclusive dominion and long duration of the parliamentary period, a tendency patterned entirely upon the first blow and on direct action, a revolutionary, quote unquote, a tendency, quote, revolutionary, unquote, in the most naked pitchfork sense, may only temporarily languish in the calm of the parliamentary commonplace in order to come to life again and to unfold its inner strength in a return to the period of direct open struggle, in a period of street revolution." Now, I think it's important, just if I can emphasize this issue, and we should discuss this further, the concept of the mass strike for Luxemburg was bound up with an insistence upon the objective revolutionary role of the working class. That is, she noted that the mass strike in Russia, that's where it emerged, did not come about because of calls for a general strike. In fact, I think she makes the point that in no country was there less talk of a general strike than in Russia. But she saw it, and there were perhaps eventually certain weaknesses in this formulation. But there was, I think, a very profound truth in this, that the mass strike manifested an organic tendency of development in the working class. That is, the mass strike doesn't emerge primarily because revolutions have called for it, but only to the extent that such a call, when it is made, it can only have significance to the extent that there is a sort of organic, objective drive by masses of workers in opposition to bourgeois society. Could we just discuss this somewhat? And wasn't it this, in fact, this element which really terrified the trade union bureaucracy in Germany?
Yeah. The trade union reacted extremely sharp against it, exactly because this mass strike debate and the conception of mass strike of the working class was bound up with the revolutionary struggle and the preparation to take power. And as you say, I think that's absolutely crucial. It was an expression of the objective revolutionary role of the working class. And that is something Luxemburg always was orientating to. She was confronted with a party which had a very strong apparatus. As we already discussed, the opportunist tendencies grew stronger. And her conception to fight that was the working class and the revolutionary energy and revolutionary capacity of the working class. The party leadership, I mean, the party was split, you can say, in three parts, the leadership. You had the right, which we already explained, very much of the trade union leadership, the majority of the parliamentary faction, and other sections who had very strong relations to petty bourgeois sections of society. On the other side, the left, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, Clara Zetkin, were fighting against the right. And you had a center faction. More and more, I mean, at the beginning, Kautsky supported the left, but he moved very much in the center. And Bebel himself, who basically until his end, he died 1913, defended a socialist perspective. But because his concept was you have to keep the party together, he did everything to keep the conflict low key, to keep it under control. And he sometimes worked for months to prepare his speeches for the upcoming party congress to speak for both factions and keep it under control. Luxemburg got sometimes very, how to say it, she was close to August Bebel, and she admired him, and she admired the enormous work which he had done to bring the working class politically to a life. But at that time, he became more and more frustrated with his adaptation and looking for compromises with the right.
There's a very good past moment in the movie. If
That's true.
you ever had a chance to see the film by von Trotta on Luxemburg, which is really a wonderful film, where Luxemburg is attending a party congress and Bebel has spoken, and then she speaks and she said, "I'm not sure I understood August very well because Comrade August, because I was sitting on the left of the audience and Comrade August kept on speaking toward the right." And there's a great uproar. But there's an issue which I just want to, since it now is coming up clearly in the discussion of the mass strike and spontaneity, and that is perhaps Comrade Peter can elaborate on the differences between Luxemburg and Lenin on the question of party organization, particularly her criticisms of Lenin on his evaluation of the significance of the conflict that arose in the split of 1903 in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. We also have quite a few questions about that. So if you could perhaps both you and Uli expand on this issue.
Yeah. Well, Luxembourg's Polish party was actually present at the 1903 Congress when it started, and they decided not to participate, and mainly because of the differences on the national question. But after the Congress, and particularly after the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, Luxembourg published a very strong denunciation of Lenin's book, One Step Forwards, Two Steps Back. And she accused him of organizing a party which basically would control the working class, which was undemocratic and so on. That, of course, was later used by all those who tried to refer to Luxembourg as a sort of key witness against Bolshevism. I know in Germany in the 1970s, this was a big issue. You know, books were brought out with some of her writings under the headline Theories of Spontaneity, dissidents in the GDR, like Biermann, a singer, referred to Luxembourg, people who later turned very far to the right and actually turned out to be not just dissidents and opponents to Stalinism, but basically petty bourgeois Democrats and opponents to socialism, and turned firmly to the right. Now, I think this conflict has to be seen in some context. I mean, Luxembourg was working in the social democracy, in a mass party. Lenin had a somewhat different background, and I think that with time, I mean, Trotsky wrote actually at the time a pamphlet which was very similar to that of Luxembourg. He disagreed with Lenin at the time, but I think the experiences, one has to see that in this context. I mean, these were issues which were clarified. I think Lenin was certainly the one leader amongst all the big Marxists of the time who most sharply understood that revisionist tendencies expressed extremely strong class forces, and that you cannot coexist with these class forces within one party, something neither Luxembourg nor Trotsky would accept in 1904. I mean, the Social Democrats, was in some way a big church. There were many tendencies. Luxembourg led a very sharp fight within German social democracy against revisionism, but she never, proposed a split with these forces. I think, particularly then the period in, during the First World War and what happened then, it became clearer how far-sighted Lenin was in this relation. And I think Luxembourg certainly, when she was when they finally decided to found the Communist Party at a very late point, she was correcting that, as Trotsky was, correcting his original decision not to join the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, which was also Luxembourg's position. I think the, developments showed that Lenin was correct on that point. But to transform that into some kind of general theory of spontaneity, which was done, I think Korsch also played a role in this, if I'm correct, and many forces, is totally wrong, because these were conflicts which I quoted Trotsky in my article, who said, these were conflicts within the framework of a revolutionary orientation, which was undoubted with Luxembourg and was proven by her reaction to 1905, her reaction to 1914, and finally the role she played in the final weeks of her life in founding the German Communist Party.
At the same time, I would go maybe a bit deeper into this issue. I mean, there were questions of, now we are discussing really the question of leadership and the necessity of leadership making a revolution successful. There is a high involvement of conscious leadership when the revolutionary struggle sharpens up, and the question of planning, having a very centralized, organized cadre party, that were somehow these issues were involved in the conflicts between Luxembourg and Lenin. So I think it would be good maybe to develop this question a bit. I mean, there were you refer to the question of the founding of the KPD, the German Communist Party, which was of course founded on January 1st in 1919, in the aftermath of the November Revolution. So at the time in Germany, when you had a massive revolutionary uprising after the First World War, there was no party as was in Russia, a Bolshevik party. So I think it would be good to I agree very much with the point that obviously we are discussing questions on the basis of a common revolutionary ground, but there were obviously questions involved, which again and again also led to certain differences between Lenin and Luxemburg.
Yes, there were differences, and I think it doesn't take anything away from the enormous revolutionary role Luxemburg played as a Marxist leader, stating that and accepting that. As we already discussed, Luxemburg worked on the conditions of a mass party which had a very strong right-wing leadership, and therefore he was very much orientated to the revolutionary mobilization and revolutionary inspiring of the working class. But at the same time, she had a certain concept and developed a certain concept that the leadership will be built out of the spontaneous movement, and it will be built in the struggle. It will be built and it will develop out of this struggle. Not that she rejected education, and I may quote some a paragraph on that, but she was of the opinion that the revolutionary energy and the revolutionary struggle of the working class is the main force, and revolutionary leadership can only be built in that framework. I would like to, in order to express more clearly what I mean, I would like to quote one paragraph by Trotsky, who refers to that. He speaks, that is in the book, The Third International After Lenin, and Trotsky's critique on the Sixth World Congress. And he says the following: he fights against what he calls revolutionary fatalism. And he says in this paragraph, er sagt, in ihren tiefgründigsten und talentiertesten Ausdruck hat diese Einstellung bei Rosa Luxemburg gefunden.
I just said in her most, so this conception found its most profound interpretation in the works of Rosa Luxemburg.
Psychologisch ist das durchaus zu verstehen.
This can be explained psychologically.
Sie würde hauptsächlich durch den Kampf gegen den bürokratischen Apparat der deutschen Sozialdemokratie und Gewerkschaften geprägt. She was.
I actually have the quote, so I can.
Okay, and you can read it and.
I can read it only in German, and then I can read the English quote.
That's good. Sie wurde hauptsächlich durch den Kampf gegen den bürokratischen Apparat der deutschen Sozialdemokratie und Gewerkschaften geprägt. Sie bewies unermüdlich, dass dieser Apparat die Initiative der Massen erstickt und den Ausweg und die Rettung sah sie nur in der spontanen Massenbewegung von unten, die sämtliche sozialdemokratischen Festungen und Barrieren umstürzen sollte. Ein revolutionärer Generalstreik, der sämtliche Ufer der bürgerlichen Gesellschaft überschwemmt, wurde für Rosa Luxemburg zu einem Synonym für proletarische Revolution. Aber ein Generalstreik mag er sich noch so sehr durch Massenstärke auszeichnen, entscheidet die Machtfrage noch nicht, sondern stellt sie erst. Zur Ergreifung der Macht ist es notwendig, auf der Grundlage des Generalstreiks den Aufstand zu organisieren. Ganz sicher ging die Gesamtentwicklung Rosa Luxemburg in diese Richtung. Und sie trat von der Bühne der Geschichte ab, ohne ihr letztes Wort zu sprechen, ja noch nicht mal ihr vorletztes. Innerhalb der Kommunistischen Partei Deutschlands haben aber noch bis in die jüngste Zeit hinein sehr starke Tendenzen des revolutionären Fatalismus geherrscht. Und das spielt in der deutschen Geschichte in der Geschichte der deutschen sozialistischen Bewegung natürlich eine sehr starke Rolle. Das war dann 1923, das Versagen.
Let Johannes Johannes translate that passage. That he has the text.
Okay. Yeah, so that's Trotsky on Luxembourg, what Uli quoted. Her formative period was spent mainly in struggle against the bureaucratic apparatus of the German social democracy and trade unions. She demonstrated tirelessly that this apparatus stifled the initiative of the masses, and she saw the way out and salvation in a spontaneous movement from below that was to overthrow all social democratic obstruction and barriers. A revolutionary general strike that inundates all the banks of bourgeois society became for Luxembourg a synonym for the proletarian revolution. But a general strike, be it ever so distinguished by mass strength, does not decide the question of power as yet, but only raises it. For the seizure of power, it is necessary to organize the armed insurrection on the basis of the general strike. To be sure, the entire development of Rosa Luxemburg tended in this direction. She departed from the stage before she had said her last words, or even her penultimate words. However, up to the very latest period, very strong tendencies towards revolutionary fatalism have prevailed within the German Communist Party. The revolution is on the way, the revolution is
that's
nigh, and so on and so forth. So that's basically what Uli quoted. So this question of a conscious plan which has to be worked out to make a revolution successful, which must play a significant role. It's not only coming out of the spontaneous development of the general strike. The question of leadership is decisive, which Luxemburg understood, but clearly Lenin and Trotsky have been working through the experience of October and have, I mean, that was what Trotsky stressed in Lessons of October. There has to be a plan, and that was lacking in Germany also in 1923, when there was the infamous failed revolution, when Brandler called off the revolutionary struggle or plan in the last minute. So I think it would be good to develop this question a bit more in the discussion, the question of the spontaneous element, which is also coming or is playing an enormous role in the proletarian revolution, but also then, of course, the significance of leadership and a worked out plan for the uprising.
Actually, I think this actually takes us, we have a half hour, and I think it would be very important to use that time if we could deal with two critical issues before we then come to certain, perhaps, conclusions about particularly the relevance of this historical experience to the present-day situation. And that is what Luxemburg's attitude to the Russian Revolution of 1917, about which there has been so much falsification, and the circumstances that led to her assassination and that of Liebknecht in January 1919. I'd like to just read a passage, and I just want to give an example of, we have one questioner who says the following, let's see if I can. A question. I am interested in the differences between her and Bolsheviks. I am on her side, based on what I know, haven't researched though. Well, I think before one should declare oneself to be on the side of Luxemburg, one should know what she actually wrote, and generally do your research. But Luxemburg wrote an article shortly before her death, which is entitled On War, the National Question and Revolution. And she says the following. This is not the essay which was published posthumously by Paul Levy after he had left the German Communist Party for his own factional reasons. An essay which Luxemburg had not had time really to edit, even though it ends with a very strong defense of the revolution. But another essay, and I just want to read this passage because it's so relevant both to her attitude to the Russian Revolution, but also to her assessment of the epoch. She says the following: the Russian Revolution, with the Bolshevik rule it brought about, placed the problem of social revolution on the agenda of history. It has taken the class antagonism between capital and labor in general to its extreme. It has suddenly opened a yawning abyss between the two classes, from which volcanic vapors bubble up and fiery flames flare up, just as the June uprising of the Parisian proletariat and the June slaughter practically divided bourgeois society for the first time into two opposing classes, between which there can only be one law. The Bolshevik rule in Russia has practically brought bourgeois society face to face with his final struggle for life and death. It has destroyed and blown away the fiction of the tame working class, with which one settles down peacefully, of socialism, which theoretically babbles harmless phrases, but practically pays homage to the principle, live and let live. That fiction, which had arisen through the practice of the last 30 years of German social democracy, and in its footsteps of the whole international. The Russian Revolution has suddenly destroyed with a rough fist the modus vivendi between socialism and capitalism created by the last half-century of parliamentarism, and has turned socialism from a harmless phrase of electoral agitation, of the blue distance of the future, into the bloody serious problem of the present, of today. It has brutally torn open the old, terrible wound of bourgeois society, scarred since the Parisian June days of 1848. All this, of course, at first only in the consciousness of the ruling classes, just as the June days, with the force of an electric shock, had instantly impressed upon the bourgeoisie of all countries the consciousness of the irreconcilable class struggle to the working class and poured into their hearts the deadly hatred of the proletariat, while the workers of all countries themselves needed decades to acquire the lessons of the June days. The consciousness of the class antagonism, so it is repeated now. The Russian Revolution has aroused in all the property classes of all the countries of the world a fervent, foaming, trembling horror and hatred of the threatening specter of the proletarian dictatorship. And just as perhaps a coda to this discussion of spontaneism and organization, and the relevance of Trotsky's very astute comment about Rosa Luxemburg's own assessment, I think when one looks at all the pre-1914 discussions, one has to state that it was really only Lenin, in his concept of party organization, who really grasped, from the standpoint of the nature of leadership, the implications of this emerging epoch, the complexity of the challenge of revolutionary leadership, the necessity to prepare a leadership of the working class for struggles of the dimension that erupted in the aftermath of 1914. The discussions which took place prior to that were of a, in a sense, preliminary character. Everything was terribly concretized by the war and then the revolution. And as we now perhaps turn to the question of the situation in Germany in late 1918 and 1919, and the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, I think it would be appropriate to discuss these questions in the slide. And if Carmardoli, if you could just elaborate, what was the situation 19 that Luxemburg confronted when she was finally released from prison in the autumn of 1918 after the outbreak of the German Revolution and the events leading up to her death?
I mean, first of all, Luxemburg was at that period the most time in prisons, and when she came out, the revolution was on its high development, and she immediately concentrated to develop the discussion in the group which she was leading, the International, to build the party. And that's what they did. They founded the Communist Party at the New Year turn, 18 and 19. And I think in his essay, Peter refers to it that she wrote the program of that Congress, and that itself was a absolute decisive step. Now, again, you could say that was under extreme difficult conditions of the development of a revolution. It would have been necessary to develop that step earlier. The situation which then developed is that Liebknecht, who is very close to the revolutionary Obleute, how you call that, revolutionary committees in the factories. This was a very it was the revolutionary Obleute was the way how the workers organized themselves. It was the most radical and revolutionary element in the development of the revolution. And Liebknecht was very close to them, and they pushed for a uprising, while Luxembourg was of the opinion that it is necessary to have more time for preparation, to create conditions where not only in Berlin, where the center of the revolutionary struggles were concentrated, but also in other areas, the revolutionary preparations have developed. But it was a situation where basically events created conditions which made it extremely difficult for both Liebknecht and Luxembourg to develop their leadership work.
Can I ask this, because this point you're raising about the developments in Berlin, which was at that moment the center of the revolutionary crisis. Perhaps, Peter, how would you compare this? Or is there a comparison to be made between the situation that confronted Luxembourg and her concerns about an effort to take power prematurely in Berlin, and the attitude of the Bolshevik, particularly Lenin, during the July days of 1918? Actually, 1917.
Yeah, I think that definitely is. I mean, the German Revolution, really exploded in November. It started with a sailor strike in Kiel in the north of the Navy, and it spread like a bushfire. I mean, you had workers' councils springing up all over Germany. You had, hundreds of thousands going into strikes. But there was no leadership. I mean, the revolutionary Obleute, as Uli spoke of, they were quite, they had a lot of conspiracy theories. I mean, they organized secretly. They were very, very effective in organizing, but they had no political perspective. Some of them then went with the USPD. One even went into the government. And an enormous revolutionary situation developed, but under conditions where the working class was not really prepared to take power, because it didn't have a party, which was organized in a way they could have done that. And that had a certain tragic. And you had, the bourgeoisie and even the military handed power over to Ebert, to the Social Democrats. The independent Social Democrats joined the government 3 ministers. These 3 people never had a word to say, but they were absolutely crucial, in subordinating still the sort of more militant sections of the SPD to this government. And then, of course, they ever brought in the army against the workers, and they didn't sack a single, leading state official, leading general. They then organized the Freikorps against the workers, and very ferocious struggles developed. Liebknecht, who was a tremendous fighter, basically tried to organize an uprising, but they were not really prepared to take power. And even on the, on the founding Congress, there were conflicts over these issues. There was a conflict even over the question if they should participate in elections or not. Luxembourg was in favor. Others were opposed to it. And you had this element sort of, anarchism, ultra-leftism, which was present. It was a major element, which was discussed within the Communist Party for several years. I mean, the third and the fourth Congress of the Comintern were concentrated on that. It was an enormous task, to consolidate this party, which grew very rapidly. Later, a whole section of the USPD came in, so it had hundreds of thousands of members. It grew like a balloon, but to consolidate the leadership, which was really organized and prepared to take power, was not there. And of course, the death then and the murder of Luxembourg Liebknecht, because Luxembourg was without any doubt the most experienced, the most, steeled leader they had, of course, cost a tremendous price. But I think that you can compare it to the, to the July days. Not so much in the sense, I mean, the July days, the Bolsheviks were still very much concentrated on Petrograd. In Germany, it was somewhat different. You had a national revolutionary uprising, but there was not, due to the fact also that, I mean, there was not a prepared leadership. There were all kind of very diffuse political elements in it. And certainly Lenin's point that you need such a leadership and you have to build it very consciously and strongly was, I think, thoroughly confirmed.
One of the reasons why this, I think, is so critical is, why I raised July days of 1917 was because in a situation like that, where the mass movement exploded, at that point, the Bolshevik Party actually had to restrain this movement. Whereas clearly in January 1919, it got completely out of control. And Luxembourg, from the reading I've done, found herself in a situation where, while she herself believed that the situation was premature, that they were not in a position at that point to take power, there simply was not a political cadre that had been trained, as the Bolshevik Party had been trained, to provide the type of firm political leadership which a revolutionary struggle requires. I think it would be helpful, though, if we could at least briefly just spend a bit more time on the actual events, how the assassination was prepared, how this took place, and who
did it? Who did it? Who was involved?
I mean, you referred to it. It's raised, but I think there may be many on this call who have not yet read your essay. So either Peter or Orly, would you just briefly review the events?
Peter, you wrote a good article on it.
Yeah. Well, what the Ebert government did, and the new books out now on the November Revolution, which bring that in detail, and it's hard to read. I mean, they were so right-wing. I mean, Ebert
immediately. Ebert was. I think it's important.
Ebert was the leader of the Social Democrats, of the SPD. He had been a long-standing member for many decades in the SPD. He became the leader of the majority of the pro-war faction during the war, and then he was brought into government when the revolution erupted at the demand of the military, of the bourgeoisie, because the military didn't want to take responsibility for the military defeat. So they decided to bring the Social Democrats in so they could blame them afterwards. And Ebert immediately formed an alliance with Groener, who was the head of the army at the time. They had a secret phone line, to organize the troop to contain the revolution. They organized Freikorps. That is, when the army, disintegrated, they organized soldiers in the Freikorps. You had in the Vorwärts, in the SPD paper, you had pages of advertisements for Freikorps who were basically recruited to fight against revolutionary workers. And there was a whole number of battles taking place within Berlin over different issues, where workers were slaughtered. And then they started to develop a witch hunt against the revolutionary leaders. There were posters on Berlin streets, "Kill their leaders," signed by the Freikorps. Open demands to kill Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Finally, they were hiding they changed location every night, but they were hiding in Berlin, and finally they were betrayed. They were arrested by one of these military groups. They were brought into the headquarters, Hotel Eden. They were abused. They were tortured. And then on the way out, they were killed. Luxemburg was hit by a button that was then brought to a car, shot in the car. Her body was thrown into a canal, the Landwehr Canal, and was only found 6 weeks later. Liebknecht was taken to Tiergarten and was shot there point blank. Afterwards, they published news that he was shot while he tried to flee. Now, the man who organized this, Waldemar Pabst, he was brought to court, and the court acquitted him. Noske, who was the defense minister, signed the acquittal. Pabst, much later, admitted in an interview that he could never have done that without the direct agreement of Noske, that is the Social Democratic defense minister, which means Ebert supported it. Pabst himself, became a leading figure amongst the Nazis, and he continued his career in West Germany, where he became a wealthy arms dealer. I think he died somewhere in the 70s. So did the man who actually shot Luxemburg, a man by the name of Suchon, who lived in southern Germany until the 70s. I mean, these people were never, taken. Pabst was taken to court, but he was acquitted. They were never punished for it. And of course, they were not the only ones. I mean, Leo Jokiches, who was for a long time Luxemburg's friend, he was the leader of the Polish section. He was taken to prison in Berlin and then shot in prison, and many others were murdered. I mean, the German social democracy, from rejecting revolution, now went to the lesson they drew from the Russian Revolution, that you have to kill the leaders before the revolution starts. And many of these elements are organized. I mean, the Freikorps became the social basis for the SA, for Hitler's stormtroops. He recruited them out of them. He was part of that milieu. And there's a direct continuation. And the so-called Weimar Republic was basically a cover, for the continuation of all these forces. They didn't expropriate the Junkers. They didn't expropriate the capitalists. They kept all these right-wing forces going. You had courts who acquitted them. You had political parties who covered them. And you cannot understand the rise of Hitler, without that. And of course, the other element was the role then of Stalinism and, their policy. But the Weimar Republic was basically a cover, for the continuation of these forces, and the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht and the brutal way it was done certainly foreshadowed, the monstrous crimes which would come and be committed by the Nazi regimes. And of course, after the war, all this was covered over, and it's coming back now.
Just on this, since we have just a few more minutes to go, in the context of the present situation, I think it would be legitimate and helpful just to review the present developments in Germany, the reemergence of openly fascistic forces, neo-Nazi forces, with a substantial political presence in Germany. Comrade Early, would you be able to speak about this?
Yes, I mean, first of all, what Peter said, that that is the character of social democracy and the SPD today. And there is no force in history which is able to take away that political crime which this party has carried out. And it's absolutely correct to say that the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht was the beginning of the fascist mobilization in Germany, which then created the horror of Nazism. Now, if you look at the present situation, you have a situation that all the unsolved historical problems of capitalism, which led to 2 world wars and to fascist terror, is coming back. And especially in the last year, through the corona pandemic, these historic crises of capitalism is enormously intensifying. I mean, it's not only in Germany, it's a world development. We see everywhere that the democratic forms of rules are disintegrating, and the bourgeoisie more and more is moving in the direction of dictatorship and fascism. I mean, the World Socialist website wrote very detailed, very strong about the situation in the US and the coup attempt, the storm of the fascist elements on the White House at the beginning of January. And this in itself is an enormous international event. America played a key role in the post-war situation in Europe and in Germany. And especially since the 30 years ago, since the disintegration of the Soviet Union, this the so-called, I mean, the whole capitalist restoration was carried out under the name of American democracy. Now, here in Germany, this, as it often is the case, for a long period, situation seems to be quite stable and moves slowly. And suddenly, there's a very surprising turn. Now, here you have a situation now where very openly the bourgeoisie is mobilizing fascist forces. Last week, they had to admit that the AfD is a fascist party. That's why they have decided, even that it has its limits, that the German Secret Service controls this party, but they gave a very long and detailed report where they proved that what the AfD is representing, is not only racist, it's basically a fascist orientation. And it is the other parties which created conditions that this party is the biggest opposition party in parliament. They brought this party in the leadership of quite important commissions of the parliament. They get, and it is this party, the AfD, which dominates German policy to a certain extent in many questions. Now, at the same time, we had some discussion tonight on the role of the trade union. I mean, is there any doubt that Luxemburg was right in her analysis of the Union when she explained that out of their whole concept, they are defending the capitalist state? I mean, they supported the First World War. They had the so-called, how they named it, the Burgfrieden, castle freedom, where they worked closely together with the government. And even when the Nazis came to power and they had the first May demonstration, at the evening of the May Day demonstration 33, the ADGB, the Allgemeiner Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, General German Trade Union Federation, they had a letter to Hitler explaining that the Union is accepting every government which is elected, and they offered collaboration. And today, this character of the unions is even fully, how to say it, fully developed. The unions have nothing to do anymore with workers' organization. They are openly working as agencies of the employers, the big companies, and the state. They are represented on the board of, how to say, controllers. They get millions for doing this. The unions are paid through the employers and the state, and they work out the plans to organize the sackings, and they push it through. They use their representation on shop floor to carry out their attacks against the workers. And that's why our demand to build independent action committees to break free and to reorganize the workers' movement independently is absolutely decisive. I think Luxembourg would be in full agreement that it is absolutely decisive now to organize the working class independently. She also would be in a vicious political fight against the left party, which is a very how to say this? I mean, it's a party which the general degeneration of the political system is concentrated very much in that organization. It calls itself left, but it's such, in all aspects, such a right-wing capitalist party. It is a party which came from a country where you didn't have private ownership of production, and they wanted it. It's their capitalist orientation is extremely conscious, and they work very close with the unions, and their whole energy is concentrated to suppress any independent movement and political development of the working class. If they call their foundation Luxembourg Foundation, that is a fraud, but it is also how to say it, they respond to the fact that the perspectives and the ideas and the political struggle of Rosa Luxemburg today is extremely relevant. And I am convinced if Luxemburg would be alive today, she would say, as we say, the preparation for coming revolution is absolutely decisive. It is not possible to build a revolutionary party in the midst of a revolution developing. It is necessary to do it before. And Luxembourg never had a, so to speak, a system of spontaneity. Her concept was bound up with education. And she had a very interesting, very, very important explanation what education really is. If we still have the time, I don't know if we have it, I would like to quote a paragraph from her pamphlet, Junius' pamphlet. And I would quote it here from the book by Dave. It's one of the many books Dave wrote. For me, it is one of the most important. And Dave refers in that book to Luxemburg from a standpoint of her concept of education on history. And I don't know if Johannes, you have that in English as well, but I would like to refer to that paragraph, which starts with the following sentence. Historisches Bewusstsein ist ein unabhängiger Bestandteil des Klassenbewusstseins. And then Dave said, die Worte, die Rosa Luxemburg 15 schrieb, ein Jahr nach Ausbruch des Ersten Weltkriegs und der Kapitulation der deutschen Sozialdemokratie vor dem preußischen Militarismus, sind heute so gültig wie damals. And then he quotes her. Die geschichtliche Erfahrung ist seine, des Proletariats, einzige Lehrmeisterin. Sein Dornenwerk der Selbstbefreiung ist nicht bloß mit unermesslichem Leiden, sondern auch mit unzähligen Irrtümern gepflastert. Das Ziel seiner Reise, seine Befreiung, hängt davon ab, ob das Proletariat versteht, aus den eigenen Irrtümern zu lernen. Selbstkritik, rücksichtslose, grausame, bis auf den Grund der Dinge gehende Selbstbetrug ist Lebenslust und Lebenspflicht der proletarischen Bewegung. Der Fall des sozialistischen Proletariats im gegenwärtigen Weltkrieg ist beispiellos, ist ein Unglück für die Menschheit. Verloren wäre der Sozialismus nur dann, wenn das internationale Proletariat die Tiefe dieses Falls nicht ermessen und nicht erlernen wollte. And
Right,
I
Do you want to quote it yourself, David?
I sent the page number, but
It's 159 actually in the English version.
it says, this is Rosa Luxemburg, historical experience is the working class's only teacher. His Via Dolorosa to freedom is covered not only with unspeakable suffering, but with countless mistakes. The goal of this journey, his final liberation, depends entirely upon the proletariat on whether it understands to learn from its own mistakes, self-criticism, cruel, unsparing criticism that goes to the very root of the evil as life and breath for the proletarian movement. The catastrophe into which the world has thrust the socialist proletariat is an unexempled misfortune for humanity. But socialism is lost only if the international proletariat is unable to measure the depths of the catastrophe and refuses to understand the lesson that it teaches. I think this discussion proves its value if it encourages comrades and our listeners not only to read the writings of Luxemburg, to study the works of the International Committee in which these controversies are addressed, but if it encourages or it compels those who are, all of you who are listening and watching this program, to draw your political conclusions. The events through which we're passing now are of revolutionary dimensions. The pandemic, the greatest political crisis, social and political crisis of the capitalist system since the end of the Second World War, is now setting into motion a class confrontation of historic dimensions. What happened, if I could speak of the situation in the United States, what happened on January 6th, 2021 is a turning point in American and in fact in world politics. The future will look upon this event in one of two ways, either as the beginning of a fascistic counter-revolution or as an event which compelled the working class youth, the best sections of the intelligentsia to begin to draw serious political lessons. American democracy, indeed bourgeois democracy, all over the world, is on death's doorsteps. The fact of the matter is, what January 6th revealed is how close the entire fabric of democratic rule came to breakdown. Please read the perspective now posted on the World Socialist website, which examines the 199 minutes in which the Pentagon, the Defense Department, the military stood down, giving the fascist gang that stormed the Capitol time to attempt a coup which, had they achieved their tactical objectives, would have more or less kept Trump in power as a presidential dictator, with virtually no resistance from the existing political setup. That was a warning, and the problems and the dangers have not passed. The central question today is the question of revolutionary leadership, and that requires the most careful review and understanding of the great historical experiences of the 20th century, of the experiences and writings and analyses of Lenin, Trotsky, and Luxemburg. And I hope that this meeting has helped in that. Before I ask Comrade Johannes just to conclude the meeting, I do want to bring to attention something we're very, very proud of. Daring Books has just brought out a new volume, The New York Times 1619 Project and the Socialist Falsification of History. This is a really remarkable work which we have recorded the major documents which were produced by the Socialist Equality Party, the World Socialist website, in response to the wholesale falsification of American history and its traditions of democratic revolutions, which are defended today only by the revolutionary socialist movement. So please go to Mehring Books, go to our website, and order your copy and get it as quickly as possible. With that, I'd like to personally thank again Comrade Uli and Peter for participating and taking the time to really review these issues. And the struggle, Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei, really stands in the tradition of Luxemburg, Liebknecht, and embodies the revolutionary traditions, principles which they defended. With that, Comrade Johannes, would you like to conclude the meeting?
Yes, thanks. I also want to thank again our speakers, Uli, Peter, but of course also Comrade David for the contributions. I also would like to thank our audience. There were many questions unfortunately we couldn't address. So clearly this discussion has to continue and we have to stay in touch. I would like also to encourage everyone now to visit Mehring Books or the Mehring Verlag, our German publication house, on mehring.com, mehring.de. As I said, there are a lot of books we published dealing with the issues we have been discussing tonight. In particular, I also would like to highlight again the Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century by Comrade David North, which includes many chapters which are actually dealing very directly with the issues we discussed tonight. Reform and Revolution. A whole chapter is dealing with the character of the trade unions. There is a chapter on Lenin's conception of the Kader Party and the fight for socialist consciousness in the working class. And there's also a whole chapter on Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, which also includes contributions by Kautsky, Luxemburg, to the development of this theory, but also makes clear how this developed. I also would like to urge you to make a donation. You can do this on wsws.org/donate. We want to organize further discussions. We want to expand our work, and we are dependent on your support, also your financial support. Again, I think it was a very significant meeting. I don't want to repeat what Comrade Dave already stressed, but I think it was significant that we didn't discuss what we said at the very beginning, Luxemburg as a mere historical figure. We discussed her as a revolutionary Marxist, and with enormous contemporary significance. I think that came out in the entire discussion. I hope we were able to address and clarify central questions of revolutionary perspective and strategy for the working class. And we are doing this under conditions where clearly what Luxemburg said during the First World War, that the alternatives confronting mankind are again socialism or barbarism. I mean, that's how deep the crisis of the capitalist system is. I mean, once again, it is reproducing mass poverty, unemployment, the danger of fascism, war, and of course, the pandemic has speeded up the whole political process. What also was intensified by the pandemic, and we already have stressed this in many perspectives articles on the website, is of course the revolutionary developments in the working class. There is growing opposition. There are growing strikes, and the decisive question is to build a revolutionary leadership in the working class. What Trotsky said, the question is the resolution of the crisis of leadership. So that's what we have to do. We have to build a revolutionary cadre in the working class to transform this growing opposition against capitalism into a conscious struggle for socialism. And that means, of course, building the ICFI, the Socialist Equalitist Parties all over the world. So I would urge everyone who is not already a member of the IC, a member of Socialist Equality Party, to join the socialist movement. I think in essence, this is really the legacy of Rosa Luxemburg today. So thank you very much and join the struggle.